Hello. Today I'm going to be giving a profile of Vietnam. Now, for Americans, many of you know Vietnam in relation to the Vietnam War, which was a conflict part of the Cold War. But I feel there's many more things to say about this country in relation to its further past and what happened after the Vietnam War and where it is today and how it is with its government. So, modern Vietnam began with French colonization. Now, this was during the time of global European imperialism, and France happened to take this land that was and would become again Vietnam. The process began in 1858, completed 1884. By 1887, Vietnam would be part of the colony known as French Indochina. Independence was declared after World War II, and this was the result of Ho Chi Minh and the communists working to kick out France. A war began and went until 1954 when France lost and Ho Chi Minh won. This led to the Geneva Accords, which stipulated that the country should be split up between the communist North and the anti-communist South. Just like Korea, the area would be split along ideology. And just like with Korea also, U.S. aid, both economic and militarily, would come to the anti-communist portion, South Vietnam, and this would grow through the 1960s. Now, as we know, this is where the Vietnam War comes in. The United States fought for the South Vietnam to continue to exist, just like in Korea with South Korea. But this would ultimately lead to a ceasefire, and U.S. forces withdrew in 1973. And it seemed like South Vietnam and North Vietnam would stay where they were, like with Korea, but the North reinvaded, and there was not much stomach in the U.S. government to, at least from the Democrats in Congress, to give aid to the South, and certainly not to give more troops to the South to protect the country. So the North was able to take the South and unify it under communism in 1975, or by 1975-76. So more than a decade after that, there was little economic growth, there was conservative leadership, persecution and mass exodus of individuals, many who were successful South Vietnamese merchants, and there was growing international isolation for the country. But all this would change in 1986 with Doi Moi, or renovation. This included economic liberalization, structural reforms, modernization of the economy, and the idea of producing more competitive, export-driven industries. This would be very similar to what China did to allow capitalism, not for freedom per se, but to create wealth so that the communist regime could survive, which is what China did and what Russia failed to do, and maybe part of why they collapsed. So Vietnam went along the route of China in this way and became a hybrid of communism and capitalism. The communist leaders maintained tight control on political freedoms, again, not ceding political freedom or democracy to the people. There was some progress on better protection of human rights, however, which is commendable, of course. So the executive branch, well, as it is right now, there was a president, Quang, but he has died in office last month, September 2018, and now the acting president, Thin, has taken over temporarily. Thind was his vice president. Thind will serve as president until the Communist Party's Central Committee can pick a successor, and then the National Assembly must approve that. There's also a head of government, the Prime Minister Phuc, and there are 5 deputy prime ministers. Now, there's also a cabinet proposed by the Prime Minister, appointed by the President, and confirmed by the National Assembly. The President is elected by the National Assembly from among its members for a single 5-year term. The last election was 2016, and the next election would have been 2021, but since a new permanent president has to be picked, that will be much sooner, of course, as soon as they can, I would imagine. The Prime Minister is appointed by the President from among the National Assembly and confirmed by the National Assembly. Finally, deputy Prime Ministers are appointed by the Prime Minister, confirmed by the National Assembly. Quang, before he obviously passed away, was elected President by 98.9% of the National Assembly, and Phuc was elected Quang was elected President, Phuc elected Prime Minister, 91%. Now on to the legislature. The National Assembly, as we have mentioned, that name, is the body of the legislature. It has 500 seats, elected directly by absolute majority vote with a second round if needed. There are 5-year terms. The last election was 2016. The next election is 2021. Election results: the CPV, the Communist Party of Vietnam, got 95.8%. Non-party members 4.2%. Now, this is important, and we'll talk about this more, but as you can see, there's only one party, the Communist Party, on this list, and everyone else is a non-party, non-affiliated with any party. This is because only the Communist Party is allowed, and that, of course, means it's a one-party state, although you can run as a non-party, but at least in the United States, you have 2 parties that have platforms that you can vote for, and you can have a choice. In Vietnam, there really isn't a choice. It's either the Communist Party or nothing, and you have to run as a completely independent person without any platform or group that you can identify with if you're not going to run as a communist. The seats by the party: Communist Party got 473. The non-parties got approved for 19. 2 were self-nominated. So 496 were elected. 2 communist-elect candidates were disqualified. Okay, so the Judiciary, there's a Supreme People's Court with a Chief Justice and 13 judges. The Chief Justice is elected by the National Assembly on recommendation of the President for 5-year renewable terms. The other judges appointed by the President for 5-year terms. There are subordinate courts for different categories, including the Appeals Court, Administrative Court, Civil, Criminal, Economic, Labor, Central Military, People's Special Courts. A note that the National Assembly can establish special tribunals. Okay, so the status of rights. So what are the civil rights in Vietnam for the people? You can vote starting at 18, and it's universal. The press, however, is government controlled. There is state television and radio called the Vietnam Television and Voice of Vietnam for the radio. The law limits satellite TV access, but some people in Vietnam do have home equipment for satellite. So it still can be accessed, but it's not fully allowed by the government. Now parties, as we talked about a little bit, there's only one party, the Communist Party of Vietnam. Other parties are forbidden by the government. But of course you can run as a non-party, so that is a good caveat that if you don't want to run as a communist, you can run as a total independent, meaning you're non-affiliated But that is flawed because it's a one-party state, as mentioned. So in other words, either when as a voter, you can only choose between what the Communist Party platform offers and what individuals offer. Now, if there's only one party, that means there's only one group with a organized platform, an organized set of goals. So with only one party, the form of democracy is here in this government, but it's flawed because only one party can have any say. So that certainly is a big deterrent there. Citizenship, not by birth, by descent only. At least one parent must be a citizen of Vietnam. Dual citizenship is not recognized, and you must have a residency of at least 5 years. A little bit more about the rights in Vietnam. There are protests, small scale, usually about land use issues. There's calls for increased political space and a lack of equitable mechanisms for resolving disputes. So obviously these are rights that people would want to have or want to have improved that Vietnam is not offering or not offering well enough. There are also protests in small urban areas, usually by human rights activists. So again, this is showing that there's problems with rights not being met by the government. And also in rural areas, there are protests involving ethnic minorities, some being Montagnards, Hmong, and Khmer Krom. And these groups also feel that they're not being given their due rights by the government of Vietnam. So that's another case here where we're seeing that, okay, these are the places where the rights are lacking or not being given at all. So trade partners. So who does trade with Vietnam? Well, Vietnam exports to the US, to China, Japan, and South Korea. It imports products from China, South Korea, Japan, and Thailand. It also participates in the World Trade Organization, the Universal Postal Union, the United Nations, Interpol, UNESCO, International Monetary Fund, World Health Organization, etc. So it has been somewhat integrated into the world market, if you will, and world government. I mean, not world government, but world governmental participation, if you will. And it has been integrated into the global market. So here's where my commentary comes in. And there's a lot to say on this, at least from my point of view. They should definitely at least have one other party to give a real choice to voters. Non-party is a choice, but it's not a real united group to vote for. In the United States, we have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. There are two platforms there. It's a choice. Okay, do I want to be on the liberal side or the conservative side? It's a real organized choice. And it's good that Vietnam allows no party preference. That's good, because that is a choice if you want to be a total independent. You don't want to be affiliated with parties. And that's good. I'm glad that they don't bar people from voting for that choice. But they should have at least one other opposition party so that people do have a real organized choice in voting, so that there are two platforms that represent at least two sides of the issues. Next, they should allow freedom of media, especially television and radio. You know, it's okay to have state TV and radio, but at least, you know, there's nothing wrong necessarily with the government having that as a way to communicate to the people, but it shouldn't be the only choices. And I know they have satellite, but they limit that. So certainly they need to allow other channels in to offer freedom of press and freedom of entertainment, and not just what the government wants to say, which gives too much power to the government and means that it's not a real democracy because it has a lack of freedom of the press. Okay, now on trade, allies, and when I say allies, I mean Western powers or democratic powers, capitalist powers, should not trade with Vietnam right now because Vietnam is not democracy, it's not a free country, not fully yet. And so the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Thailand should not give money and get money from Vietnam because it's only bolstering this flawed democracy, this one-party state. And so until that's fixed, those countries should not trade with Vietnam, especially the U.S. When we fought so hard to protect South Vietnam, only for it to be absorbed back into the country that we were fighting against, and then for their policies to be implemented anyway. Now, how did the U.S. start trading with Vietnam? Well, apparently John McCain, the late John McCain, John Kerry, and Bill Clinton, when he was president, opened up Vietnam. Now, I believe this opening up of trade, like with China, was too early. It's not a real republic. It's not yet fit to be integrated. And this is to a larger point that the Cold War as we know it, even though we say it ended in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell, it's still going because there are still other countries that are outposts of communism or socialist dictatorship. Now, obviously in Europe, Western Europe, there is socialism, but they have democracy in the form of their government at least. But there are other countries like Vietnam that are real dictatorships or at least one-party states that are still legacies of the Cold War that have not been dealt with, and they should not be able to participate in the Western economies because they're not ready yet to be a part of it until they have full democracy. Now let's go back a little bit. So after Vietnam kicked out France, which is known as the First Indochina War, the war with France and Vietnam, let's assume that the Vietnamese politicians at the Geneva Accords were at the table, okay, and I assume they were, and assuming that they were at the table again, the North invading the South after the Accords is illegal, or would have been illegal, because if the North and South agreed that they were going to be split into communist and anti-communist countries, then the North invading the South after that agreement is totally illegal. And that means that the U.S. coming to the aid of the South is at least partially justified that they would do that, because that's because the North was breaking the agreement that I assume they were at the table for, meaning that the communists and the anti-communists were at the table, and yet they broke that agreement. The North broke that agreement. This is similar to the Korean War. There was a North and South, as we talked about, divided by the Cold War ideology. The U.S. came in to save the South, except in the Korean War, it ended with both sides still there, and even today. But in Vietnam, it failed. The U.S. war to save the South ended up failing. And this was after 10 years of involvement. Some of that time was only with advisors and then later with troops. But the war, obviously, as we know, became a quagmire. And at home, there were protests and just general eventual anger across the board about the war, and so the military exited. The ceasefire was agreed to, and I'm not sure on this, but I believe the U.S. promised aid to the South. I'm not sure on that, but I thought that was possibly the case. If the North tried to invade again, that the U.S. would send help, at least in the form of weapons or money or whatever, to the South to help the South protect itself. However, that didn't happen. When the North started invading again after the ceasefire, after the U.S. left, President Ford, again, if I understand correctly, begged Congress in a statement, in an address to Congress, begged, please send support for South Vietnam to keep them going, to keep them from being destroyed, from that country being destroyed. And a lot of Democrats in Congress, as mentioned, they were done with it. And I don't fully blame them. They were, this had been such a terrible failure for the U.S. and they were done with it. And I don't know if there were some Republicans that felt the same way, but President Ford was also right that we can't allow the North to do this, and yet that's what happened. So, in other words, the current government of Vietnam today is the result of the North having an illegal victory over the South. Okay? So the North was the aggressor, and the North absorbed the South, and that resulted in what country that we have today. So literally, the South was destroyed in the sense of that government being destroyed, and Vietnam today is the result of that. Okay. Now there is progress in the sense of economics, and also the form of democracy is in place. However, full freedom is still needed, and the South should be considered to be reinstituted, if not the country becoming fully democratic. So either the whole of Vietnam needs to become democratic now, or the South should be reinstated, at least, okay? Because if they can't agree on democratizing the whole country, the South was illegally destroyed and should be allowed to have self-determination to be reinstituted, because they were illegally invaded twice, and the second time resulting in their destruction. So the people of Vietnam should vote, perhaps, on whether the country should be split back into two with clean elections, or the UN could vote on partitioning the country again, or the current government, if we're not going to bring back South Vietnam, at least the current government needs to be reformed, especially if we're going to trade with the country. Okay? So, with all that said, and this is opinion, but with all that said, I believe that, Vietnam, with all the sacrifice that was put into it, into South Vietnam, needs to be looked at further. And it's a tragedy that has not been resolved yet, and I believe it still needs to be resolved. So with that said, here are some credits. The images are from the CIA World Factbook on Vietnam. The facts I provide are also from the same place. Commentary is by myself, Ryan Otis. The video is not endorsed by the CIA. And again, the commentary and suggestions are my opinion, interpretation on these facts. Thank you, and this has been a production of Ryan Otis.